the presentation. Now, I will confess I have just figured out how to screen record a presentation, so it may be a little bit clunky while I figure things out. I wanted to talk to you today about adherence, and this is a pre-recorded version of the session I did last week, purely because the technology failed me slightly. And what I wanted to do is talk to people, or talk to you guys, about the question that I get most consistently, which is how the hell do I stick to the plan? Because it's all very well having a plan, but sticking to it really is an entirely different matter. So let's go through it and see what we can do. So, long-term consistency beats short-term intensity, and this is one of the fundamental reasons that I program my nutrition in the way that I do, because rather than programming in really quick losses with really harsh deficits, which often leads to yo-yoing back to your start weight, or even heavier than your start weight, we look at building a long-term plan, something that you can stick to, something that's going to teach you some really healthy habits, and allow you to learn what it is that your body needs and be able to develop habits that will stick with you long term. So let's talk a little bit about adherence. So all diets work. Most people have lost weight at some point, whether it's on purpose or whether it's through illness, but most people have been able to lose weight. The most important question is what happens after the diet. And I've talked to a number of you around things like Slimming World and Weight Watchers, and where I think the flaws are in them, because they are businesses and they are designed to make money for the organisations that run them, and so it isn't in their best interest to teach people how to successfully maintain their weight once they've stopped engaging with the group, because that loses them money. So what I'm aiming to do is I'm aiming to teach the long-term habits, get people into the mindset of being able to maintain their weight once it's come off initially. And as most people know, and many of you will have done it yourselves or know people that have, you get the before diet, as in the image, you get the after diet, and then you get the after, where not only has the individual in question put on the weight that they lost, but also a whole lot more on top. So in general, we do not have a weight loss problem in this country. People aren't stupid. They know how to lose weight. What they don't always know how to do is how to maintain their weight loss. So we don't have a weight loss problem. We do have a weight loss maintenance problem, and it's that yo-yo dieting that is so problematic in terms of the way it impacts people mentally and physically. So when are we most likely to break our diet? So there was a study, and the results were released in 2017, that looks at that very question. They took 189 overweight and obese people and put them on a 12-month behavioural weight loss program. And a behavioural weight loss program is not just prescribing people a diet as such, but helping them in terms of the behaviours that underpin how they eat. And 3 times through the study, they filled in a questionnaire, and that helped monitor their behaviour and monitor the progress they were making. And they did this questionnaire for 2 weeks at the start. They did it for 1 week at 6 months, and then 1 week at 12 months. And what the people running the study found, or what they wanted to know, was how often did people break their diet, where they had a lapse in their adherence, or where they were when the break happened. Did it change at the point of the diet that they were in? So did they find that they were going to lapse more often at the beginning, or once the behaviours had been more ingrained towards the end? And they counted a break from their diet as eating more than intended, eating something that you hadn't intended, or eating at a time that had not been intended. So what were the results? On average, there were lapses or breaks from diets 4 times per week. So that is 4 times in 1 week where something was eaten that either wasn't intended, that wasn't in a place that was intended, or wasn't at a time that someone intended to eat. And the number of these breaks in diets were associated with rates of weight loss. And the most common type was eating foods that people didn't intend to eat. And this is a really, really interesting one. And it starts to look into how much your environment impacts on what you eat, and also how your feeling impacts on what you eat as well. Most common place for a diet lapse or a diet break was at home, which isn't surprising because a lot of us are at home at points where traditionally we might find it hard to stick to what our plan is. Most common time for that break was in the evening. Again, evening is a time that's really heavily associated with not being able to stick to a diet plan, so it makes sense that in the evening, when people are at home, that's when the breaks happened. And unsurprisingly, risk of diet break was higher on weekends versus weekdays. Why could that be? Potentially because different routines over the weekend. If people are at work, that provides a distraction for a significant proportion of your waking hours. And it also provides structure generally, so you're not able to access food as readily. Whereas at the weekend, your access to food is much greater. And not only is your access to food greater, but your access to a wider variety of food is greater. So anyone that's taken their children shopping, how hard is it to walk up and down the aisles in a supermarket without wanting to eat what you see? If equally you've gone to a shopping centre that's got lots of restaurants, you may not have wanted to eat the really calorific, tasty pasta dish, but all of a sudden your children have begged for pasta or pizza, you're in Pizza Express or Zzz's, and you are surrounded by choices that you wouldn't normally have, which makes sticking to things much, much harder. So what have we learned from this? So eating foods we didn't mean to at home, in the evening or at a weekend, this is a time we're going to hit a big lapse. So we need to have a plan. Having willpower or motivation alone is not enough to see you through those tricky times. And I want you to start thinking now about what your plan would be to help you overcome those tricky times in the evening. Most of us understand how it feels to get the children in bed or to get home from work and finally hit a point where you relax on the sofa. And that's when you want something really nice to eat. You want a glass of wine. You want something that you hadn't necessarily factored in. So what is the plan that we can come up with that will help us overcome this? And there's a number of ways we can do it. We can limit access to the tasty things that we want. So it's going to be much harder to have a glass of wine if you haven't got any wine in the house. Or if you have got wine in the house, you have wine in the house that you don't enjoy, because most people aren't going to go and drink wine that is, say, red wine if they don't like red wine just for the sake of having a glass of it. So limiting access to the foods or drinks that you really reach for can be one way of doing it. Planning an evening schedule, an activity, can reduce the risk of it. So something like going out for a walk, doing an exercise class, something like doing something manual with your hands, could be doing a grown-up colouring book, could be doing some arts or crafts, but basically doing something that keeps your hands busy and your brain active can be really, really helpful in limiting those problem times. You can structure your diet so you're full at the times that you would normally find you are tempted. That really works for some people. For some people who eat not necessarily because they're hungry, but for other purposes, this doesn't necessarily help as much. But being really full in the evening when that craving hits can help you avoid it. Equally, weird one, brushing your teeth when that craving hits can help, because most people don't like to eat straight after they brush their teeth. So that's a really useful thing to think about. And you can also minimise your feeling of either being hungry or feeling like you're having to say no by factoring that in. So if you really love nothing more than a glass of wine or a gin and tonic after the children are in bed, or after you've got home from work and you are relaxing on the sofa, factor it in. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that can be helpful slightly later on. And another point is, we are all individuals. The approach that I use won't work for everyone. The approach that any of my clients use are unlikely to work for other people because we're all different. We all have different triggers that make us want to eat. We all have different triggers that help us resist that urge to eat. And so find what works for you. And that doesn't necessarily mean finding something and it will work straight away, but try different things. Try and find your own coping mechanism that makes life easier for you. So, Adherence 101, the very best diet is the one you can stick to. So, people ask me a lot, what's the best diet to go on? And I say, well, what's the thing you're more likely to stick to? Other people ask, do I have to cut out carbs? Do I have to go ketogenic? Do I have to have meal replacement shakes? Am I ever allowed to eat chocolate? Will I ever have a glass of wine again? And all of these things, all of the answers for those are very dependent on the person that asked the question. Because if eating carbs is important to you and you enjoy it and it doesn't make you feel ill and you can do it in moderation, then why would you need to not do it? If you can factor it into your plan, then absolutely do it. If you hate eating carbs and really enjoy fat, then we'll take a ketogenic approach. If you really want flexibility so you can have a little bit of everything that you enjoy, then that is what we'll do. So the very best diet is the one that works for you, which is why I don't prescribe meal plans, which is why I don't prescribe fat and carbohydrate targets, because it's all about you eating what fits in with your lifestyle, what fits in with your personal taste, but just doing it in a way that is moderated by hitting the calorie target that you've been given. So, diets that work via suffering and deprivation tend to fail, mostly because people will hit a point where they no longer want to suffer or they no longer want to feel deprived. A really good example of this is people that cut out carbs for the reason purely for weight loss, not because they don't enjoy eating them, not because they have a negative impact from eating them, but just because they heard from someone in the office that that can help with weight loss. And it will, but not for the reasons you think, and this is something we will cover later on. But it only works while you're willing to deprive yourself, and inevitably most people will get to a point where they're just not willing to do that anymore, and that's when they hit their failure point, and that's when their confidence takes a battering, because they're like, well, I was doing so well, I failed, I'm a bad person, I can't do it. And if you've got those thoughts in your head, it's really hard to pick yourself up, dust yourself off and start over. So fit your diet to your lifestyle. Do you like to have breakfast? Excellent, eat breakfast. Do you hate breakfast? Excellent, don't eat breakfast. Do you like to have tea with your children, which means you eat slightly earlier? Then absolutely fit it to your lifestyle. In terms of the way we lose weight, the way we time meals isn't particularly important unless you are looking at competing or powerlifting, where the timing of your meals can help with your training, can help with your overall goals. But otherwise, just make your diet work to your lifestyle. You love having your snack in the evening on the sofa once you get to relax? Factor it in. I make my gin and tonics on a Friday and Saturday morning the first things I track, and I build my day around that, just because it makes life so much easier. And why fight all the battles all at once? Fit the diet to your preferences. If you enjoy eating smaller meals and eating more often, then stick with that. If you prefer to eat larger meals and want to eat less, then that's great. This is technically a form of intermittent fasting where you might not eat breakfast or a morning snack, but you eat between, say, midday and 8, and because you're eating during less hours, you get to have more calories for the meals that you're eating, and it's a really good way of doing things if that's something that works for you. If someone told me I couldn't eat breakfast, then I would spend the entirety of my morning eating or wanting to eat and having to fight that. So rather than fighting it, go with what works for you, for your lifestyle and your preferences. Fit the diet to your taste. I alluded to this earlier. I don't give people a fats or carbohydrates target. I give them a calorie and protein target. The reason for that being, as I waxed on about for many moons, is protein is the macronutrient that helps us feel fullest for longest. It also helps our body prioritise burning fat as a fuel source rather than muscle tissue. In terms of fats or carbohydrates, don't sweat it. Enjoy food to your calorie and protein target, and you will make decisions that influence your fat and carbohydrate intake, and don't worry about it, because as long as you're in your deficit, then you will be losing weight, and as long as you're hitting your protein, you'll be losing fat rather than muscle. So again, and I'm going to refer back to the point I made at the end of the last slide, what works for Adam might not work for Eve or Steve. We are different people. We all take a different approach. One of the things that is really frustrating as a personal trainer is seeing people, hearing what other people have done and automatically adopting that as sacrosanct. So it's a really big thing with being ketogenic or being vegan, is that it's a fashionable thing. It's getting results for some people, and as a result, people are blindly following them down that route without necessarily understanding what it means for them, and without necessarily giving it the thought it needs, and without working on the basis that they're an individual. So this one is absolutely cracking. When you start a diet, generally, what do you want? To be slimmer. When do you want it? Now, if not last week. And that isn't the way it works. We also tend to set ourselves targets, so this is when I want to hit my goal by, which also doesn't necessarily work in the way we would like it to. And let's look at why. So January 1st, traditional time for people to have a New Year's resolution, set themselves a goal, and then they think, I'm going to get there by May, it's fine, I'll hit it, no problem. And they think it's going to be a lovely straight downward line and it's going to be really straightforward and they're just going to stick to it and it's going to be really easy. Human nature to plan the best case scenario, so no one's at fault for thinking it's going to be straightforward. It's just what we do as people. We're mostly pretty optimistic. So before I move on to my next slide, to lose weight, you don't have to be perfect, you simply have to be better. And this is something that influences what you're going to see on the next slide, and also influences how people feel about their diet, because a lot of people have a good and bad kind of polarization of how they're eating, and they're either on it or they're off it, and when they're off it big style. What people don't necessarily think of is it's kind of a continuum. You are just making individual choices to eat things, and those individual choices add up, and that consistency adds up, and that's going to give you your result. So talking about dieting success, this is how it really looks. Rather than that really, really nice straight line down that takes us from January to May, what we have is a really wiggly line that wobbles and goes up and goes down and goes roundabout, and it takes us longer to get roughly to where we want to get to. Because we are human beings, it's very rare that people are going to be perfect all the time. And even if you are eating exactly the right things all the time and you're always in a calorie deficit and you're always hitting your protein targets, your body doesn't necessarily work in that way. We are not machines. Our bodies deal with different hormonal fluctuations. They store energy from food differently. We deal with sodium differently. We deal with carbohydrates differently. And all of these things have an impact on what you see on the scales. And so our journey is always wibbly wobbly, it's always round and about, and it almost always takes longer than you think it should. So, takes longer. Overestimate, when you're setting yourself a timescale, overestimate how long it will take. And generally, your downward moments are your wins. Your upward readings are where you learn, because if your weight has gone up, the initial instinct is to panic. We don't need to do that. We use that as a learning point. So we ask ourselves, 1, did we stick to the plan? Honestly, did we do what we said we would? Did we do what we know works to get you to where you want to be? If the answer is yes, okay, so why have the scales gone up? And you can look at what you've eaten the day before. Have you eaten more carbohydrates than you would normally? Have you had a heavier, more heavily salted meal than you would normally? If the answer is yes, your body will be retaining water, either because with carbohydrates, your body retains 3 to 4 grams of water in the muscle for every 1 gram of carbohydrate-based energy it stores. for if you've had a salt heavy meal, your body retains water to help flush the salt through. If you are a woman, you have fluctuations in your weight because of water retention due to the hormones that hit every point, well, at various points throughout your cycle. And all of these things are things we can learn. All of these things are absolutely not failures. In the words of someone wiser than me, and I'm going to apologise in advance for my language, we cannot fuck this up. It is just food. It is just eating. Sometimes we make decisions to eat things that aren't the optimal meal, but wouldn't life be boring if we only ate the things that were optimal all of the time? We are social creatures in the main. We use food a lot for socialising, a lot for family gatherings, and it's really hard to stick to it all the time, and you shouldn't have to, because you should be confident and you should know that having some time off, having some time to enjoy yourself is really, really valuable. And we learn from those things that we do. We learn how that impacts our body. We learn how that impacts on our weight. So our downs are our wins, our ups are our learns, and it takes longer than we think it will. Everything is an experiment, and this is so true. When I give you a calorie target and a protein target, this is based on an estimate of what your body needs on a daily basis. And what you do is you try it for a few weeks, and we look at your results and we think, is that there and thereabouts? Is this giving you the results you want? If the answer is yes, then the experiment so far is a success. If the answer is no, we tweak it and then we experiment again. And it's all about learning how well your body responds to things, what your body does when you give it particular foods, particular training, and it's all about experimenting to find what works for you. Fat loss principles are universal. Fat loss application is individual. So I will say, until I am blue in the face, the fundamental cornerstone of fat loss is a calorie deficit and eating a high amount of protein. How that is applied to you as a person is down to you. Your meal timings, whether you have 6 meals a day or 3 meals a day, whether you go low carb or not, whatever you want to do, that is down to you. But the principles are the same: calorie deficit, high amount of protein. So, going to talk a little bit about another study about weight maintenance. And this is based on people who'd achieved a weight loss goal. And weight maintenance is impacted generally on people that have had more of initial weight loss, have a physically active lifestyle, they eat regularly, and that doesn't have to mean they eat 3 meals a day and 2 snacks, but they eat regularly in terms of they're not going for long periods without food and then having a lot of food all at once. It's about that regular rhythm. They eat less calories through dietary fat, they eat more healthy foods, they have a reduced frequency of snacks. They have flexible control over their eating, so they are in control of what they're eating rather than eating what they're told to eat. They self-monitor, so it's all about that tracking. And they have a coping capacity to deal with things that life throws at them. What we just talked about, living life, understanding the impacts of that on your weight, but not stopping yourself from living. And they also have the capacity to handle cravings. When a craving hits, they use those coping mechanisms that they've come up with that helps them not to reach for the things they would normally. And they have autonomy. The way they eat is their decision. Doesn't necessarily mean it will be the same on a day-to-day basis, but they are in control of their diet. And at that point, I'm going to stop for today. We're moving on to calories and what they are, creating calorie deficit and eating in a calorie surplus next. And that will be recorded and shared with you at a later date. Hopefully you haven't been too bored and that's been helpful for you. And I will